The bell above the bakery door gave one small, ordinary ring, and Vivian Mercer stepped in out of the cold, shaking rain from her coat, with no idea that she was about to walk straight into the one door in the entire city she should have been dreading. She had come for bread. She had come, if she was honest with herself, mostly to escape an empty apartment and a week of board calls that had left her hollowed out in a way no amount of success ever seemed to fix. She did not notice the man's back first, bent over a proofing tray in the kitchen doorway, flour dusted along his forearms. She noticed his daughter first, a small girl at the corner table, who looked up from her coloring book with a smile so open and unguarded that Vivian, against every instinct she had cultivated in 15 years of corporate leadership, smiled back. It was only when the kitchen door swung open, only when the tall, quiet man stepped out wiping his hands on his apron and froze mid-motion, his eyes locking onto hers with a recognition that hit the room like a dropped plate, that Vivian understood exactly whose kitchen she was standing in. Her stomach dropped. The bread in her hand suddenly felt like evidence of something she could not take back. To find out how the CEO who fired a grieving father would end up standing frozen in his kitchen doorway a year later, unable to look away, stay until the very end. 3 years ago, none of this existed. Not the bakery, not the little girl's easy laugh, not even the version of Ethan Calloway standing in that doorway. 3 years ago, there was only a gray Tuesday morning that looked like every other morning at Callaway Logistics Solutions, a mid-sized firm nestled on the 9th floor of a glass building downtown, its walls lined with framed testimonials from clients who trusted the company because of one man's quiet, relentless precision. That man was Ethan, 36 years old, a senior operations analyst who had spent 9 years building the very supply chain systems the company now depended on to survive its biggest contract renewal of the decade, a $42 million logistics deal with a national retail chain that would either cement the firm's future or, if it collapsed, cost 60 jobs by spring. Ethan had once been the kind of employee people pointed to in meetings, the one who caught the error nobody else saw, who stayed late without complaint, who never raised his voice because he never needed to. But that had been before the phone call at 6:14 in the morning that still replayed behind his eyes some nights, the doctor's voice flat and careful, explaining that his wife Grace, 34 years old and healthy by every account, had suffered a sudden cardiac event and had not survived it. Before he became a single father to a 7-year-old girl named Lila who asked, for the first 3 months afterward when her mother was coming home from her trip, grief did not announce itself politely in Ethan's life. It moved into his body and rearranged the furniture. He forgot meetings. He missed a deadline for the first time in his career. He sat in a conference room during a client call and simply stopped speaking mid-sentence, staring at a spot on the table because he had, without warning, pictured Grace's hands, the way she used to fold laundry with a kind of stubborn precision, and he could not finish his thought. His supervisor noted it, human resources noted it, and Vivian Mercer, the company's CEO, a woman known throughout the building for building the firm from a 2-person startup into a 60-employee company through sheer force of standards and discipline, noted it most of all, because she was the one under the most pressure of anyone in that building. Vivian was 44, sharp-suited, unmarried by choice, and entirely consumed by the retail contract renewal that was, as she put it in 3 separate board meetings, the difference between this company existing in 5 years or not. She had grown up watching her own father's small manufacturing business fold because he let sentiment cloud his judgment, let a struggling employee slide for too long out of loyalty, and it had cost the family everything. She had built her entire leadership philosophy in opposition to that memory. Performance was performance. Results were results. She did not know about Grace. Nobody had told her, because Ethan, quiet and private even in his best years, had not told anyone beyond his direct supervisor, and his supervisor, new to the role and afraid of Vivian's temper, had never passed it up the chain. All Vivian saw, scrolling through quarterly performance flags on a Tuesday morning with the retail contract signing 4 days away, was a senior analyst with 3 missed deadlines, 1 abandoned client call, and a productivity report that had fallen off a cliff. She called him into her office at 9 a.m. that morning. The room smelled faintly of espresso and new carpet. Rain slid down the window behind her desk in long, unhurried lines, And Ethan stood in the doorway in the same gray sweater he had worn 3 days that week, because doing laundry had become, for reasons he could not fully explain to himself, one of the hardest tasks of his day. Vivian did not ask him to sit. She told him, in the clipped, efficient tone she used for board presentations, that his performance over the last quarter had become a liability the company could not carry into a contract signing of this magnitude, that she needed people who could be counted on without exception, and that effective immediately his position was being eliminated. She said nothing about noticing anything unusual in his behavior, because she had not looked for a reason. She had only looked for a pattern, and the pattern told her everything she believed she needed to know. Ethan did not argue. He did not explain about Grace, about Lila, about the nights he lay awake doing math in his head, rent against savings, against the cost of the after-school program. Lila still asked to skip so she could come straight home to him. He only nodded once, said that he understood, and asked if he could clear his desk before lunch, so Lila would not have to see him carrying a box out of the building after school pickup. Vivian, for 1/2 second, felt something flicker at the strangeness of that request, the specificity of it, a man worried about his child seeing a cardboard box. But the flicker passed, because her mind was already back on the 4 days until signing, and she said only that HR would process his severance by Friday. He left her office, rode the elevator down 9 floors alone, and stood outside in the rain for a full minute before he could make himself walk to the car, because some part of him understood that he had just lost the last stable thing keeping his and Lila's life recognizable, and he did not yet know what would take its place. The severance check arrived on a Friday, and Ethan sat at his kitchen table that night after Lila had gone to bed, the number staring up at him from the paper the way numbers do when they are meant to represent both an ending and a beginning at once, and he did the only thing that felt like it belonged to him rather than to grief. He drove, the following Saturday, past a squat brick building on the corner of 5th and Larkspur that he had walked by 100 times without truly seeing it, a building with a faded gold sign that still read Hendrix's Bakery in peeling script, dark windows, a padlocked door, weeds pushing up through the cracked sidewalk out front. He had heard once, in the vague way people hear about the businesses around them, that the elderly couple who ran it for almost 40 years had closed it when the husband's health failed and never reopened it, and that the building had sat empty for 3 years since. Ethan stood on that sidewalk with Lila's small hand in his, her nose pressed to the dusty glass, and she said, in the plain and devastating way that children say true things, that it looked like a place that was waiting for somebody. He bought it 2 weeks later for a fraction of what it would have cost a year prior, using nearly all of his severance and the small cushion of savings he and Grace had built together, a decision that terrified him and steadied him in equal measure. What followed was not a montage of triumph but 11 weeks of unglamorous labor, scrubbing 40 years of flour dust from tile grout on his knees, replacing a cracked oven element himself after watching 17 tutorial videos at midnight, sanding down the same counter 3 times because the finish kept bubbling in the July heat. Lila was there for almost all of it, in rubber boots 2 sizes too big, sorting mismatched measuring cups into a drawer by size, insisting on naming the ancient stand mixer Gerald because she said it looked like a Gerald. It was Lila, in fact, who found the recipe box tucked behind a loose panel in the pantry, a metal tin full of index cards in shaky cursive, and it was one particular card, stained and soft at the corners, labeled simply Mrs. Hendrix's Sourdough. Do not rush it. That became the bakery's first true success. Ethan followed the instructions with the same quiet exactness he had once brought to supply chain spreadsheets, and on the bakery's opening morning in September, 11 people showed up out of curiosity for the strange sourdough smell drifting down the block. By November, there were 40 people in line before 7 a.m. He never advertised, he never needed to. The bread did the talking, dense and dark-crusted, and unlike anything from the chain grocery down the road, and so did the sight of him, a tall, quiet man in a flour-dusted apron with a small girl doing her homework at the corner table after school, waving to regulars by name, remembering that Mr. Alvarez liked his rye toasted twice, and that the retired schoolteacher 2 blocks over always wanted her coffee before her bread so it wouldn't get cold while she waited. What people did not know, because Ethan never told them, was that some mornings he still woke at 4 a.m. from dreams where Grace was folding laundry in the next room, and that he baked, in part, because his hands needed something exact and physical to hold on to while the rest of him grieved. He built the bakery out of the wreckage of the worst year of his life, and slowly, loaf by loaf, it became something neither he nor Lila had expected. Not just a business, but proof that they were still, in fact, a family capable of building something good. Meanwhile, 9 miles away, Vivian Mercer's contract had closed successfully. The 60 jobs had been saved, and she had been proven right in every measurable way about the decision that mattered most to the board. But something about the way Ethan had asked to leave before lunch, so his daughter wouldn't see him, carrying a box, had lodged itself somewhere in her. Small and persistent, the way a splinter works its way toward the surface over weeks rather than days. She told herself it was nothing. She had made harder calls than that one. But some nights, reviewing the next quarter's performance reports, she found herself pausing on the empty line where his name used to be, and she could not have said, if anyone had asked her, exactly why. 8 months would pass before that splinter finally worked its way to the surface. It was a cold Saturday in late November when Vivian Mercer, exhausted from a week of back-to-back board calls and craving something that was not another sad desk lunch, let a colleague talk her into trying the little bakery on Larkspur that everyone's suddenly obsessed with. She almost said no. She had a stack of vendor contracts waiting at home, and she did not, as a rule, wait in lines. But she went. Mostly because she was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, and she found herself standing at the back of a line that stretched out the door into the cold, breathing in the smell of dark bread and cinnamon, and thinking absurdly of her grandmother's kitchen, a memory she had not visited in years. Near the front of the shop, a small girl in a paint-stained cardigan sat at a corner table with a coloring book, and when Vivian's shoe accidentally scattered the girl's crayons across the floor, the girl looked up without a trace of annoyance and said that it was okay, that crayons rolled all the time. That was just what crayons did. Something about the calm, matter-of-fact kindness of it made Vivian crouch down to help gather them, and within 90 seconds she was sitting across from a 7-year-old stranger, learning that her name was Lila, that the bakery had been her and her daddy's project, that they had found the sourdough recipe hidden behind a wall like buried treasure, and that her daddy made the best bread in the whole world because he never rushed it, just like the lady who used to own the shop said to. Vivian found herself smiling in a way her own staff would not have recognized. She asked where Lila's daddy was, and Lila pointed proudly toward the kitchen doorway just as it swung open, and Ethan Calloway stepped out wiping his hands on his apron, and stopped dead in the doorway. For one full, suspended second, neither of them said anything. Vivian felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her, recognition landing in stages. First his face, then the gray sweater she now remembered from a rainy Tuesday morning, then the full, sick weight of what she had done to him nearly a year earlier without ever knowing what he had been carrying. Ethan's expression did not twist into anger. It only went still, the particular stillness of a man who had learned, over the worst year of his life, that reacting rarely changed anything. He said only quietly that it was good to see her, and asked if she wanted her usual black coffee, though of course he did not know her usual, and the small joke landed strangely tender in the tense air between them. Vivian left that day rattled in a way she could not name to her staff on Monday morning. She returned 3 days later, alone, and asked Ethan plainly if they could talk. Sitting at the same corner table where his daughter did her homework, she told him she had learned, only weeks after his termination, second-hand and too late, that his wife had died the same year she fired him, and that she had spent months since then unable to fully explain to herself why that fact sat so heavily on her. A woman who prided herself on never being sentimental about business decisions. She offered him money, a settlement, quietly and sincerely, more than enough to expand the bakery, hire staff, take pressure off entirely. Ethan declined it without hesitation, not out of pride, but because, he told her, money could not undo what had happened, and what he actually wanted was smaller and harder to buy. He wanted her to understand that a person's worst season did not erase who they were underneath it. Because he suspected, from the tired lines around her eyes and the way she kept glancing toward Lila's table, that Vivian was carrying pressures of her own, that nobody at that company had ever thought to ask about either. She kept coming back after that, first with a stated excuse, a vendor meeting nearby, a coffee she claimed to need, and then, as December wore on, with no excuse at all. She helped Lila with a school project on family trees at that same corner table one Thursday evening, while Ethan closed the register. And she found herself, for the first time in years, laughing freely, the kind of laugh that surprised her own throat on its way out. The bakery's second crisis arrived just before Christmas, when the ancient walk-in refrigerator failed overnight and threatened 3 days' worth of dough and a holiday order for 80 dozen rolls that a local shelter was counting on for its Christmas dinner. Ethan worked through the night with a borrowed generator and sheer stubbornness to save what he could, and Vivian, without being asked, showed up at 5 in the morning with a company contact who fixed commercial refrigeration units, quietly covering the cost herself and telling Ethan only that it was the least she could do, though both of them understood by then that it was no longer about debts owed at all. 1 month later, an ordinary Thursday afternoon would change everything neither of them had said out loud yet. By January, Vivian Mercer had started arriving at the bakery, not on Saturdays but on ordinary Tuesday mornings before work, standing in line like everyone else, learning to fold the delivery boxes the way Ethan liked them stacked, learning that Lila took her hot chocolate with exactly 2 marshmallows and grew quietly offended by 3. She had begun, without entirely admitting it to herself, to structure her week around the hour she spent in that small kitchen that smelled of yeast and cinnamon, and she noticed, with the same sharp attention she once brought to quarterly reports, the particular competence with which Ethan ran his small operation, how he tracked inventory in a battered notebook with a precision that would have impressed any operations department, how he had, without any formal training, built a rotation system for the sourdough starter that guaranteed consistency down to the day, how he treated every person who walked through his door, regular or stranger, with the same unhurried attention he had once given to his most important client accounts. It struck her, standing at the counter one gray Tuesday, that the very qualities she had once flagged as failing, the slowness, the quiet, the refusal to be rushed, were, in this context, exactly what had made the bakery succeed, and she understood, with a discomfort that sat low and heavy in her chest, that she had mistaken a grieving man's careful survival for professional decline, and had never once asked why. The moment that changed everything between them arrived on a Thursday afternoon in late January, when Vivian brought her company's head of catering, a brisk and skeptical woman named Renata, to sample the bakery's sourdough for a potential corporate order, a contract that could have set the bakery up for the rest of the year. Renata was polite but unconvinced until she watched Ethan handle a batch of dough that had, due to a temperature fluctuation that morning, begun rising too fast, threatening to ruin the day's order entirely. Rather than panic, Ethan calmly adjusted the proofing time, redistributed the dough into cooler trays, and explained, without being asked, the exact chemistry of what was happening and why his correction would work. The same clear and exacting explanation he might once have given in a boardroom about a failing supply chain. Renata left an hour later, having signed the contract on the spot, telling Vivian in the parking lot that she had never seen anyone talk about bread the way some people talk about engineering. It was in that same parking lot, standing in the cold with her coat pulled tight, that Vivian finally told Ethan the full truth she had been circling for weeks. That in the chaos of the retail contract renewal, she had let a stack of performance numbers stand in for a human being she had never actually taken the time to see, that she had built her entire leadership philosophy around never letting sentiment interfere with judgment, and that meeting him and Lila had taught her, slowly and uncomfortably, that judgment without understanding was not strength at all, only a narrower kind of blindness. Ethan listened without interrupting. The same stillness in him that had once been mistaken for indifference now clearly, to her, the mark of a man who thought carefully before he spoke. He told her that he did not need her apology repeated, that he had already forgiven the decision itself months ago, standing in the rain outside her building, because holding on to it would have cost him something he could not afford to lose while raising Lila alone. What he had not yet forgiven, he admitted quietly, was his own fear that letting her back into his life, and Lila's, meant risking another loss neither of them could survive. It was Lila, in the end, small and unguarded in the way only children can be, who cut through the hesitation between two careful adults. Sitting at the corner table one evening in early February, coloring while the grown-ups talked in low voices near the register, she looked up and asked, plainly, whether Miss Vivian was going to be her friend forever or just for a little while, because she said she did not think her heart could handle just for a little while again. The question landed in the quiet kitchen like something dropped from a great height, and Vivian, crouching down to Lila's level, found herself answering before she had fully decided to, telling her that she would very much like forever, if that was all right with both of them. What neither of them knew yet was that forever for them would begin in just over a year. On a quiet spring morning, neither could have pictured on that rainy Tuesday 3 years before. The corporate catering contract that Renata had signed became, over the following months, the bakery's steadiest source of income, funding the hire of 2 part-time staff and freeing Ethan, for the first time since Grace's death, from the exhausting math of survival that had shadowed every decision he made. But the more meaningful shift happened quietly, away from any ledger. Vivian began showing up not as a customer or a benefactor, but as something that had no clean professional name, sitting with Lila over homework, learning to laminate dough alongside Ethan on slow Sunday afternoons, absorbing flour into the sleeves of blazers she used to reserve for boardrooms. She told her own board, eventually, in a meeting she had once would have considered a moment of professional vulnerability she could not afford, that the company would be instituting a new policy requiring managers to have a documented human conversation before any termination tied to a performance dip. Not because compliance demanded it, but because she had learned, at real personal cost, exactly what such a policy might have prevented. Several board members were surprised. None objected, and one, an older man who had known Vivian's father, told her quietly afterward that it was the first decision she had made in years that reminded him of the company's original values rather than only its bottom line. Ethan never asked for that policy, never asked for any public credit or apology beyond what Vivian had already given him privately, which was, in its own way, exactly the kind of restraint that had defined him since the beginning. But when he heard about it secondhand, from a former coworker who still came in for rye toast twice a week, something in his chest loosened that had been tight since a rainy Tuesday morning nearly a year and a half earlier. The wedding, when it came the following spring, was small and unremarkable by any standard the world usually applies to such things. It took place in the bakery itself, before opening hours, with flour still faintly dusting the windowsills and misses. Hendrix's old recipe tin sitting on the counter, like a quiet witness to everything it had helped begin. Lila, no longer 7 but 8.5 by then, insisted on carrying the tin down the short aisle between the tables instead of flowers, informing everyone present, with the same plain seriousness she brought to most declarations, that the recipes were the reason any of them were standing there at all. Vivian wore her mother's earrings and cried in a way her old colleagues would not have recognized, and Ethan, when it came time for his vows, said very little, only that he had once believed the worst year of his life had taken everything from him, and that he had learned instead that it had led him, one loaf at a time, to a family he had not known he was allowed to hope for again. Weeks after the wedding, on an ordinary Tuesday morning with rain sliding down the bakery windows in long, unhurried lines, Vivian stood behind the counter, wrapping a loaf of sourdough for a customer. A small framed photograph now hanging on the wall behind her of Ethan, Lila, and the elderly Hendrix couple who had once run this same shop, a gift from a neighbor who remembered them. And Ethan caught her eye across the kitchen and said nothing at all, because by then, some things between them no longer needed saying. If there is one thing worth carrying with you from this story, let it be this. The people the world files away as failing, as slowing down, as no longer worth the investment, are very often carrying weights nobody bothered to ask about. And the same stillness that gets mistaken for decline can just as easily be the quiet, patient work of someone rebuilding something extraordinary out of the wreckage. Somewhere near you, right now, there is very likely a person like Ethan, underestimated, overlooked, judged only by the surface of a bad season. Stay a little longer with the people around you before you decide what their story means, because the whole truth, more often than not, is still being written behind a closed kitchen door.